Welcome to Orchestrate All the Things. I'm George Anatiotis and we'll be connecting the dots together. Stories about technology, data, AI, and media and how they flow into each other, shaping our lives.
Data Rules is a book about data, but not just about big data crunching. A book about the relationship of data with economic institutions and society, but also about the interplay with data technologies by which data are being generated and processed. A book that is critical but not ideological. This is how Jannis Kallinikos describes Data Rules, Reinventing the Market Economy, a book co-authored by himself and Cristina Alaimo and recently published by the MIT Press. Jannis Kallinikos is a full professor of organization studies and the CISCO chair in digital transformation and data-driven innovation at Lewis University, Rome. This is where we met to talk about the key concept in Data Rules. I hope you will enjoy this. If you like my work on Orchestrate All the Things, you can subscribe to my podcast, available on all major platforms, my self-published newsletter, also syndicated on Substack, HackerNoon, Medium, and DZone, or follow Orchestrate All the Things on your social media of choice.
I'm a professor here now in Lewis the last 4 years of my life, where I teach and do research on matters related to technology, the connection of technology with society and with economic institutions. But this line of research goes back many years when I was professor at the LSE from the year 2001 to 2021, roughly, where I resigned to get this position here in Lewis, and where I have done a lot of work, research, several of these matters, published a number of articles. That's what we academics usually do. And these articles are articles in scientific journals, never particular. Written several books and participated to some degree or another in public debates. So my predominant orientation has been contribution to what we may call scientific discourse. So this is a short story of mine. I was in Greece, in a little town of Greece. It's called Prevaza. It's a nice place to be. Where I grew up, I went into the high school, and then I studied in Athens before I moved in Sweden, where I got my PhD from the University of Uppsala, what the Scandinavians call the Cambridge of Scandinavia. It's the oldest and very prestigious site of learning.
So I have to say the occasion for having this conversation today is the fact that you just published a book, which in many ways touches upon what has been the main theme for this podcast as well. So data and by extension everything that people do with data and for data. The book is called Data Rules. Has just been published by MIT Press, if I remember correctly.
Yes, that's correct.
Mm-hmm. And would you like to just share a few words about what actually drove you to write this book? When did it start? Your co-author, because I know you didn't write it on your own. What has been the process that led to?
Yeah, it's important to point out that this is a book co-authored with Cristina Alaimo. It has its own history, to some degrees an offspring of some of the things I've done in my life previously, and some of the things also Cristina. We started writing of this book with no clear idea of where we should go. We wrote thoughts around the importance of data and the way data impregnates social and economic relationships, how they shape them, how they are the outcome of these relationships, economic and social, and how they feed back on these relationships and change it. And we thought that one of the reasons we felt that we drove us to write this book was that we were pretty unsatisfied of the ways these things have been debated in the literature and in the public discourses. Sometimes simplified, sometimes polarized, like the issues of surveillance, for instance, and privacy, sometimes without really taking the time to dig into the particular details of how this society of ours and the technology we're using work. One example is, for instance, the work of algorithms, which is used in abundance, but God knows what people mean by this thing. I have a very clear idea. We write also in the book, we juxtapose data to algorithms, and we're probably going to speak about it, but it's just one example of how uncritically many of the trends that are characteristic of our society, how uncritically they have been picked up and been used and reproduced. And this was a kind of, dissatisfaction that drove us to writing this book. We had the idea of presenting a book in which the idea of data was not just big data crunching, but the relationship of big data not only with economic institutions, but also with the wider society, and describe some of these relations that we thought are very closely associated with the work on data, the technologies by which data are being generated and processed. And some of these changes, I hope I'm going to speak, but just let me mention for your audience, have to do partly with the emergence of platforms as a particular types of economic entities, and also the separation of private life and the home from the wider institutional life. They come now back together in a ways that deserve particular attention. But these were some of the broader motives. There was a history to summarize, there was a history on how these things have been approached by me and by my co-author, Cristina Alaimo, but also in some dissatisfaction that we thought we had the knowledge to at least clarify in some ways.
Okay, so it sounds like if I were to pick one word out of everything you said to characterize the essence of the book, that would probably be critical. You take like a critical viewpoint on the use and on the origins of this whole data culture, let's say.
I would agree, George, with one reservation. We are not ideological. We are critical. The two things are separate. There's a lot of writing against these trends, which has a very heavy ideological mark. I am not an ideologist. I'm a social scientist, a critical one, but still, task, as I understand, is to present reasons to show the people that want to learn about this as to how things are the way they are. Some of these reasons are linked to privileges, but not all.
It's a clarification worth making because I do realize the word critical has some, connotations, let's say, that could lead people to think otherwise. So it's worth clarifying that.
Thank you.
So then my question is, who do you think would benefit the most out of this book, and who is your primary audience for this book?
That's what the Americans call a 1 billion question. I think the primary audience should be academics across the fields of management, sociology, organizational sociology, social psychology, media and communications, information systems, and presumably some of these fields we call data science and statistics. So about the latter, I don't believe so much. So this would be the audience. Academics spread all over these fields. But we also intend, George, to address all people that are educated and have an interest in understanding where this society is going. How can all these changes be understood, summoned into a framework, analyzed and understood? And that is something that goes beyond academia, and I think embraces people with some level, of course, of education, that which are widespread in society and do not need the academics, and they aren't academics. So this is a second audience, which we hope to reach. For this reason, some of the writings of this style of writing is still an academic one, but it's simpler than articles we publish in academic journals because it has this aim. Now, I can also say some of the people that can benefit from such can also be leaders in critical positions, whether in governments or in particular in economic organizations, because these leaders still to understand what's the role of data, how technology makes the production process itself, what is changing here if they are to make informed decisions for themselves and by extension for society, for economy and society.
I think you just summarized what I would gather as the approach of the intended approach of the book in terms of making an impact. Because at the end of the day, in my mind at least, whoever writes a book, for whoever writes a book, the primary result of writing the book be making an impact, having an impact. So in your case, that would probably be what some people call influence the influencer. So you're not aiming directly for the man on the street or the woman on the street, but mostly for academics and, let's say, opinion makers, thought leaders, whatever you want.
I think it's a good description of the audience of the book. It's a very large audience. It's an international, global audience of, I would say, millions.
Okay. All right, so let's start getting to the core of the book. But in fact, I think before we do that, I thought it would be good to read some of the core ideas of your work, because in my mind, they probably underline, they form like a foundation for everything else you've laid on top in this book. So I'm not going to lie, I wasn't familiar with your work previously. The little research I did have the chance to do, two key concepts came out. One was the information gravity and information habitat, and the other was the theory of digital objects. You're the best person to summarize those for us, so I will kindly ask you to do that.
Both of these concepts are recycled in the book. Some of them also have been expanded by the work of Cristina separately from me, in particular the concept of data objects. But they are important, but they are not the core of the book. We draw very much on them, but the core of the book is to understand the forces of society and economy that generate these masses of data. They use these masses of data, and they used to make everything from money to making up people, the way people think, behave, and act. So that's the primary purpose of the book. We start with 3 basic chapters. We trace the history of data. And the immediate and alternate take of ours in the case of data is that data are not statistical entities, are not what the statisticians and data scientists call simply data points. They are obviously these. We can pile them up and calculate them. But they are more than that. We call them cultural records. They have been used much before the digital age to do a number of things, to structure exchanges of economic goods, to monitor them, to record them in terms of accounting and other kind of recording systems. And in this quality as cultural records, data do more than just provide the elements or the inputs to standard calculations that are now performed by big data analytics, by algorithms, by data science, and by statistics. So this was a primary and fundamental reason for laying the foundations of data in the book in 3 chapters, then tracing the difference between data as cultural records prior to the digital revolution and analyzing and showing what the digital revolution brought into all the records humans, organizations, institutions use to monitor their lives, their transactions, and their whereabouts. We make this contrast by drawing on fundamental information science concept, as this science has been laid down by such pioneers as John von Neumann and Claude Shannon, mathematical theory of communication. And we try to make the contrast between prior forms of data and digital data. And out of this, to understand what digital data do that other data didn't do, but also understand that digital data are data nonetheless. This, we felt, has never done by anyone. And this is one fundamental aim of the book. It's called Foundations and comprises chapter 2, 3, and 4. It describes the history of data and the revolution, in short, brought about by digitalization and then the burst of communication that came with the internet and social media and the age we live together.
And the Internet of Things and everything
all
that's
of this
coming after that.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the things that I liked about this book was that it started right away with stating very clearly the primary objective. And I'm going to quote here. So the primary objective, as stated in the opening sentence, actually, is to analyze the forces that install data at the center of contemporary life and reinforce the functions that they perform in the economy and society. This is very clear. At the same time, it's also rather hard, in my humble opinion. I was wondering, it just laid out how you started.
Yeah.
How would, and you also mentioned previously that the primary audience is academics and, well, opinion makers, thought leaders. How would anyone else besides these people be able to follow your argumentation?
I don't know, to be honest, George. I'm proud to respond to your question. It may need some help, perhaps from you guides that are able to take some of these complex ideas and make them more digestible for a broader audience. This is one way. The other way is, and it's mostly a hope or perhaps an illusion, you may say, that even the educated woman or man would find it interesting to spend some time and get a little bit of a headache, if I may say so, to go through the book.
That's another interesting quote that caught my attention. You state that well-established boundaries of modern societies, such as those between work and private life or between the economic and the social spheres, are less clearly demarcated than
from one another
in the data age.
Yeah.
So that statement made me think a bit. I would tend to agree with that, and I think probably many people would also tend to agree. Yeah. However, especially since we're talking about academic discourse, and for that matter, data and data science and data-driven arguments and so on, some people may ask, like, okay, fine, intuitively that may sound true, but do you actually have any data to back that up or any argumentation to back that up?
I think it can be quite easy to find the data, though we don't do this in the book. But let me start first from the intuition and this general idea that you say it looks like a credible argument, and then see what we can think about metrics. If you take Facebook or TikTok, what you see is that your life, your private life, your interactions with friends and colleagues is the center from which money are being made by Facebook and TikTok to mention just the two beasts that dominate our life. There are others, the Google. So the money here are not made by producing a product in a secluded organizational setting, the factory, or any other kind of setting, the bank, for instance, the insurance office, that is being made out by crunching data that comes from our life. This is the most conspicuous fact, that what once was a relatively, because it was always relatively insulated, never absolutely. But what was relatively separate before, your private life and the economic institutional life, they come together. So this is what grounds our own observation. We have seen this growing and growing and growing. Even communal life that was then in the square or in the market is now being recycled into these kinds of forms through data and interactions that record what people do on the internet, or record what people do with their devices, the Internet of Things that you mentioned before, and take all this data and produce either services or recommendations and other kinds of prompts that really come back and say what people do and what choices they commit. These, I think, are clear evidence of the importance of data. Another one is obviously that the modern home has become a data center, really. There's a variety of devices, most of them powered by the Internet of Things based solutions and now by AI. And what's going on in the little and secluded spaces of the house is now public good or good for the company. It is another fundamental, so to say, inspiration or kind of evidence that shows how the private domestic life that was once relatively apart from the institutional and economic life becomes intermeshed, how the two become intermeshed. Now, metrics, what metrics you can find of this? I believe you can have a lot of metrics that relate to the use of utilities, for instance, which are all powered by smart meters and internet-based solutions, could provide an idea about, for instance, how you measure the exposure of homes into institutional processes. There may be others as well. I don't have any direct solution at this time to this problem, but that was our idea. And this idea without, okay, you can provide a metric, but that's not the most important thing. All the discussions then we have, privacy, is based on this fundamental chain. Even though quite a few people from the legal or economic fields, they do not reflect about the structural changes underneath that have made privacy a major problem. What we say, and this is chapter 5 in our book, is that we call it an excursus into privacy and surveillance. The fundamentals of the modern problem of surveillance and privacy is the fact that this separation is not anymore what it was once. And therefore the channels for interaction between people's private lives, domestic lives, intimate even lives, and the wider world is permeable, is porous. They are crossed every day thousands of times. So,
there are some interesting points to be made on this observation. Well, I think one fundamental point is that, well, it does happen. There's no debating on that this is taking place. But the interesting thing is that it seems to be happening actually voluntarily.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I emphasize it seems, because if you start digging a little bit, you may actually unearth that it's not entirely voluntarily. I mean, it's 2024. I mean, by now, people are actually born into this whole culture of having devices everywhere, of having mobiles everywhere, of everything being recorded and somehow processed and all these things. So, in fact, it takes very, very strong will, and you have to be very inventive and very decisive to step away and say, like, wait, this first you need to realize that this is happening. And in some ways, it's like asking for fish to realize that they're swimming in water. So first you have to realize that this is happening, and then you have to come up with ways to actually go about in life without being embedded in this whole phenomenon. And this is not as simple as it seems.
No, it's not. And as you say, it's partly voluntarily and partly not. Look, what mobile to choose is your own choice. But the use of mobile is not a choice anymore. That's the point. What computer you will have, laptop or a small tablet, is your own choice. But whether you will have a laptop, I don't think is a choice anymore. You need to have. So you go with the flow, as the English say. But then within this going with the flow, you can make one or another choice. And it's important to understand this difference. You can also decide that you don't want a computer. That the 95% of people will not go for this choice. And that's also important to understand the numbers we're speaking about. The majority of the people will go with the flow. Only a small part may want to have another kind of life. Just understandable. But these 95 that go with the flow, they don't make really a decision whether to go with the flow. They make smaller decisions once they decided that they go with the flow. What computer to buy, or what car, if you like, to buy, or so this is sometimes we mix these different levels of reality. I'm not clear how we speak about that.
Interestingly, in the MIT series under which your own book is published, the previous book is in some ways precisely about that. It's called Virtual Amis, and it's a study on the way that the Amis use technology. And I didn't read the book, but it just caught my attention that I kind of quickly browsed through it. And it studies how, it says, even the Amis nowadays, to some extent at least, despite their beliefs and cultural and value system, to some extent they actually have to have some level of interaction with technology because, for example, they need to sell their products to the market, and in order to do that, they need a laptop, they need a web store, and so they realize that they cannot insulate themselves
as they did before.
But what they do is that they try to limit their exposure to technology as much as possible and to as few people as possible.
I think it's a good example. Unfortunately, I don't know this book, though I know quite a few books from the series. But this one it has escaped my attention, but it may worth for having a look at it. Thank you for bringing it to my attention.
It's in my reading list as well now. Let's see. There was a reference in your book about the interlocking of data with socioeconomic institutions, and in that context, you mentioned Chandler's the emergence of modern corporations in the first half of the 20th century to the systematic generation of a variety of internal records. And that reminded me of something else which I read in some other book, another reference, in fact. That book was a book written by someone called Michel Bowens. The book is called The Peer-to-Peer Manifesto. And it makes a number of interesting points and references, but the particular one that drove me to establish this connection was that at some point we examined the origins of the double bookkeeping system. And they also claim that this has played a fundamental role in shaping today's socio-economical institutions. Do you agree with that?
I agree, but if you are referring to the work of Stomberg, Werner Stomberg, who is being more or less contemporaneous with Max Weber. He has been an economist, Max Weber is a sociologist, He's less well known than Weber, but he made a number of points about how double entry bookkeeping was essential for the foundations of middle and then late capitalism. We don't enter in particular detail this argument. I have respect for Stomberg, though I believe that some of his arguments are controversial. And one of the arguments, for instance, that I would distinguish ourselves and the book from this kind of thinking is the fact that double entry bookkeeping is not a superior technology in terms of supporting profit generation. This could have done even without double entry bookkeeping. And that is an important point. It's difficult to understand, but what double entry bookkeeping is doing is to pierce down the various moments and activities of the firm or the corporation. Track the amount of resources and money spent in different activities in different times, make comparison between one side here and another side there, and see why this side is more profitable than the other. In this respect, double entry bookkeeping has been an essential a foundation for building up big corporations and businesses. And this is the idea of channel. This idea we adopted, and I don't think for this you need an argument about capitalism or non-capitalism. It's an idea that says that the practices of managing the large corporations would have been impossible without the data produced by double entry bookkeeping. We take this idea further, we build on it, we make comparisons with digital data, what digital data change here, and then we continue by, as I mentioned before, the discussion about privacy and surveillance, and what comes into the second part of the book, the emergence of platforms and digital ecosystems as other ways of organizing economic life.
I find bookkeeping an interesting area of focus because it's something that, to some extent at least, everyone can relate to, everyone is familiar with. Okay, not everyone is an accountant, obviously, but even if not, you know, everyone still manages, you know, their personal finances, so they can understand the concept of, like, you know, expenses, incoming and outgoing, and all of that stuff. So, and I think it's also interesting to relate this idea to the concept of externalities, because to me that's a very good example of highlighting the fact that data is not as objective, let's say, as it's as it's supposed to, as it's projected to be.
Absolutely. Let me take first the opportunity to make this note that the small preface that has been written in our book is written by Mike Power, who is a force and a professor of accounting at the London School of Economics, and very well known. And so he has written a 3 pages preface into this. So he comes from this tradition. Absolutely. The fact, and here we can enter a critical, or even, if you like, even ideological debate. So being critical is enough, so I think. And approach accounting and how accounting institutionally and over time has chosen to record economic activities and their outcomes and see what problems it has not tackled. The externality has not been dealt with. For instance, the pollution of the environment is being done by the firms, but there's nowhere to be found in accounting books. These costs are being offloaded to society and being dealt with tax money procured by everybody, not by the firms. This is a critique, and this is how what some of my friends may call capitalism works. It's not the general rule of thought. But going back into your observation, this shows exactly that even this data that may at first seem hard data, they are really the outcome of several assumptions, predilections, interests, and I would say also unintentional biases. Not all is calculated. And it's important to say this is one of the fundamental ideas we pursue heavily in the book, to claim that data are not objective entities in the sense that many people think of them. They have, of course, arrived. They are not hallucinations, but they are not objective in the sense impartial. They are produced by society, the dominant relationships we have, by what we know, and the way what we know is involved, in the production of value, goods, and all this kind of stuff.
So, add to this conversation about data not being objective, a somewhat technical, let's say, observation or point of view. Even in the profession, let's say, of data modeling, data modeler is someone whose job is to study a domain and come up with a model that accurately describes this domain for the purpose, typically, of creating an application that will serve an organization working in this domain. So, interestingly, typically when you get, for example, two different people model the same domain, they will not come up with the exact same model. And that already tells you something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's the element of choice is an assumption is creeping in at any moment. I would agree with this. Yeah.
There's another point that you make that caught my attention. So in the analysis of data technology, you discuss the interplay, technological nature of digital data, and the formalized operations embodied in software systems and devices by which they're produced. And that made me think, because when we talk about algorithms in general, it's a broad category.
Yeah.
And there are, I would very roughly say that there are basically two types of algorithms. Let's say one type of algorithms that are deterministic, in the sense that they somehow, let's say, are similar to mathematical equations like x plus y equals z. But there are also non-deterministic algorithms, in the sense that of statistical learning and machine learning and AI, or whatever it is you want to call it. Do you think that there is a qualitative difference to be made that is important in how these two types of algorithms interact with the environment and with the organizations?
Yeah, that's a very complex question. I think some of these issues we already touched upon in George. Let me take the opportunity of your questions and say the following. Let's resist the common parlance. Algorithm has not been invented yesterday. It's a word that has 1,000 years of history. If we speak about algorithms as important today, it's because these algorithms are non-deterministic. They are able to do something which all the procedures of calculation, fixed procedures of calculation, a number of steps we call algorithms, could not do. And this sends us at the center of modern computing and cognitive psychology, because what this, and artificial intelligence, because what these non-deterministic algorithms can do is to use neural networks to incorporate lessons from data, revise simply their answers, so in the next step produce something which didn't have in the previous step, and do this mostly on their own. In this respect, now to simplify, this is a very complex discussion, but this is why we speak of algorithms now, because they have a force, and if you like, an agency, as it's been called, the capacity to act, which deterministic forms of algorithms never had.
I would argue that algorithms by themselves have zero agency. What gives them agency is people's decision to trust their outcome or not trust their outcome. But for example, if you are an organization that chooses to screen job applications by applying some kind of algorithm, as far as the law is concerned, it doesn't matter what type of algorithm you choose to apply. What matters is that the algorithm has to be transparent. It has to be explainable. So you have to be able to explain to people or to authorities, this is why I chose this person or that person, or these are the criteria that made me arrive at this decision.
I agree. If I understand you well, I agree with this. That algorithms can have some agency, let me say some agency, in the sense that they have automated procedures for act and react, something which previous technologies didn't have. And in this respect, there is a difference. Now, whether you want to call it agency or not, capacity to act or just an automated calculation is a matter of preference, I believe. But I think the majority of the discussions we have about the importance of algorithms at some point, and even if it's never explained very clearly, assumes that these algorithms have a space of calculation that are enacted internally by this algorithm or its interaction with other algorithms and critically with the data that are being fed into the algorithm, because algorithms without data are nothing, and make therefore decisions that those deterministic algorithms of the past could never have made. This is a fundamental difference. So now if you expand that space, and it seems that this space is expanding more and more and more and more with artificial intelligence, you are justified to worry about what the general outcome would be for companies, for governments, but also for people, their works and the way they live daily. Who will make these decisions? How transparent will they? On what ethical grounds they will be made? These are legitimate concerns, even if very often are not being portrayed sufficiently with sufficient clarity in the public discourses.
I agree. I think this conversation in public discourse has only now begun to grow, to gain visibility. And what personally worries me is that the rate at which technology is evolving and the rate at which, well, this space is dominated by a handful of players is much greater than the rate at which an educated discussion can take place and interventions cannot take place.
Absolutely, yeah. Things go forward very quickly. Yeah.
You already spoke about the first three chapters of the book. Do you want to quickly take us through the rest of the chapters?
We'll have a chapter after the three, which is the one on privacy and surveillance. We will take a critical look for these discourses on privacy and surveillance. The chapter is called Excursus on Surveillance because it's detour in some ways, but one we felt was substantial. We reject the straightforward understanding of surveillance as evil. We think it's a much more complex concept, and the social processes described are much more ambiguous and complex. We draw on what we feel is the original understanding by Foucault of surveillance. Michel Foucault is a French philosopher and a professor in the history of ideas with a big impact 20, 30 years ago or 40 years ago. We take on his idea of surveillance. We expand it by using another prominent philosopher of our time. He also dead now, Ian Hacking, and a few other people to build up the idea that surveillance constructs persons, not only subjugate them, and try to understand how these diffusion of data and the way data enable surveillance also enable a number of positive things. They are not only expressions of the will to subjugate others, as George Orwell, for instance, the concept of surveillance of George Orwell, which is very prosaic. You have the big brother is watching you, he wants to subjugate you. The concept of surveillance a la Foucault is more elaborate and more complex. Schools surveil students, but they build up experts. To give you one example, the outcome is not negative only. It has negative aspects, but it's much more complex, and together with the negative, it has also many positive aspects. And therefore, how data, to come to today, how data impregnate the life of people, do have certain negative outcomes, but it has a lot of positive outcomes, as where you and I, George, are to some degree persons that have been shaped by this development. And by the way, Google and Facebook is surveilling us, if you want to. And the way we use them to build up our capacities, not only to become subjects of their volition, passive objects of exploitation. We reject this idea. We think that surveillance is a much more complex concept. And unfortunately, a very close friend of mine and someone who I admired for a long time, Susanna Zuboff, has taken this idea to very negative and limited directions.
You're talking about the famous surveillance capitalism.
Yeah. I am one of the first that have read this book when Susanna wrote it. And it was just a manuscript. Although I'm a very close friend of them, I love her, but on this I disagree. I think it took some real trends of society, but gave them proportions, too big proportions. We are not puppets of Google, for God's sake, all of us, and not puppets of Facebook.
Well, I think it's beyond debate the fact that surveillance is happening.
Yeah.
Whether this is a good thing or whether this is purely evil or it has some good sides to it, or whether it's entirely one-sided or not, that may be up for debate.
So this is chapter, therefore, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's called an excursus on surveillance. It's a critical reapproach surveillance and privacy, because by the end of this chapter, we take up the issue of how social relationships become economic transactions. And the difference, we talked earlier before, the difference between social and economic life, personal and institutional life, economy and society become increasingly blurred or attenuated, if you want me to use a less strong word. After that, the book enters a much more economic or managerial domain, if you like, though we see it mostly as a book, as chapters in the history of economic sociology, but some people may read them more narrowly. So it's an attempt to understand what happened in production of goods and the generation of value at the core of the economy. As data now become the most pervasive component of value generation. And data, as you see in TikTok, in Facebook, in Google, are being produced not in a particular corner of society, the shop floor of the factory or the office, are produced into the open world. And what does that change? This is another expression of the difference between work and private life, economy and society. And how these beasts that are being generated, and we call platforms, digital platforms better, that are the most conspicuous beasts, economic organizations that operate in this world, and everybody wants to become a platform now, even Caterpillar, Siemens, and all others built up industrial platforms to work on data, not on the machines that once produced. These are important, but they become secondary in significance, no matter how important they are. So we discussed, therefore, the idea of digital platforms, from where these ideas come, how they have been manipulated, how they reflect the changes in society, and the concept of digital ecosystems, which we exemplify with some hard empirical work that Cristina has done on something which is called programmatic advertising, how automatic systems now allocate basically adverts in a scale that is beyond imagination in a second into online spaces in digital media. So we discussed this concept of ecosystem, and this is also the give me one more minute to say this, George, because this is the title of the book also, Data Rules. Taking all these things together, we say that the diffusion of data and the way they are need to be available, processed, crunched, and to produce value, impose a system of new rules that are juxtaposed on those of the traditional market and market exchanges, or rules that have been linked by other very prominent technologies, for instance, Carlis Baldwin from Harvard, to the design of technology. So there were therefore two fundamental discourses. One, which is the standard economic discourse, that you have market, you have competition, you have prices. So what's going on is the exchange of these things. What Carlis Baldwin has done with Clark and a few other major economists is to say that many of these things are being increasingly shaped the way technologies are used to create, shape distinctions between areas of life. So the architecture, how the technology parses a life, what, for instance, is software and of a particular kind, and what is software of another kind. How one technology is being linked to another. This is a question of architecture. They call this book, they publish design rules to show that technology and the traditional market logics, they come together. And how the technology parses the world, for instance, between different types of goods. Cars here, electronics there, or other kinds of things there, they impact divisions in the world that shape how the economy performs. Do you get me? Yeah.
Yep.
So we take, therefore, these market rules, the traditional market rules, and these design rules, which we very much believe in, and say that what we have analyzed in the previous pages of the book bring forth an evidence that there is a third system of rules that have to do how data are generated, how available, who has availability and accessibility on them, under which terms, and how are these data being processed and made goods. These rules, we claim, impose a third layer of constraints and possibilities, which is worthy of reflecting. This is how the book ends.
Well, an example comes to mind to potentially showcase this parallel that you drew between design rules and data rules. So you mentioned how design rules refers to the way technology may draw boundaries on the market side of things.
Absolutely.
The example that sort of immediately popped to my mind was, well, let's take mobile phones and the standards for mobile phone chargers. As you may know, up until recently, there was actually not a standard in the EU.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it was only recently
that the standard has been...
that the standard has been
exactly.
exposed.
This is a very good example Other standards, other issues that easily come to mind is, for instance, how smart devices are linked to other kinds of devices. You need some basically architect solution for this. This is what Baldwin and Clark mean by the design rules. So some of this stuff, therefore,
in the data world, the equivalent to that would actually be things I did refer to data modeling previously. So things like the choice of data modeling language per se, but also on a second level, the choice of concepts to model and how to model them exactly. This shapes interoperability of platforms.
Absolutely. Without this interoperability, the platform would not really have existed.
And in fact, there are cases, not just cases, I would even go as far as to argue that it's the de facto, let's say, situation is one in which different organizations working on different platforms go out of their way to avoid being interoperable in order to have to lock in their audience, their users, and to maximize their reach.
Absolutely. It's one of the tricks for gaining significance here. But when we say these things, George, I think it's important to make some distinctions here. I think this is a great observation of yours. But still the concept of interoperability is a concept of design. It falls well within what Baldwin and Clark, Henderson, and a few other economists call architecture. The idea of data do something more. And I think the concept here that we need is not interoperability, but commensurability. Because data, for instance, from private life are taken up to produce, for instance, credit scores for individuals. Looking at with whom you interact, they may produce credit scores. This is something which you can't understand as interoperability. You can only understand it as commensurability, which means
interoperability would apply to the technical level of how you get data out of one system, out of your device, out of your Facebook or whatever, into the credit institution system. This is just the technical level.
The technical is important, but on this,
it's only important as an enabler, not.
Yeah, it's important, but it's important also to understand that the data bring different worlds together. When you have data on Facebook interaction with credit scores, we'll give just one simple example. There are thousands of these things happening. You bring together two different worlds. So this is what we think the concept of commensurability, which is part of the data rules, not the design rule, makes sense.
I think this is a great, even though perhaps alarming.
There are alarming things here, undeniably, but also some good things.
Great, even though perhaps alarming way to also wrap up, bring this conversation to an end, and just ask you as the final, as the epilogue to this. So, what are your hopes and your plans for this book going forward?
Books once written and published, George, they take their own life in some way, and we do hope that we will generate the discourse across the social sciences, and also in discourse across sectors of our society. The one you and I have is an example of this, and I imagine that also your podcast will be a further example of this. That hopefully, that's our hope is. We will instigate or will drive people to rethink some of things, also provide people, both academics and normal people, if I may say so, or educated people, provide them with some fundamental insights and even, if you like, analytic tools for, approaching the complexities of our society and our economy. If we could make a contribution into this, it would be fantastic. Yeah.
I would say that's a noble aspiration.
Yeah.
I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's see what will happen.
Thanks for sticking around. For more stories like this, check the link in bio and follow Link Data Orchestration.